Well, okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Indiana Council on World Affairs Distinguished Speaker Program, featuring this evening's guest, Mr. Kevin Cassidy, Director of the United States Office of the International Labor Organization, the ILO. We'll be recording Mr. Cassidy's comments this evening. Mr. Cassidy, can we go on record that we have your approval to record? Okay, great. My name is Larry Cimino. I'm the president of the Indiana Council on World Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome so many members and guests from around Indiana and around the country to our continuing series of distinguished speaker programs. I especially want to welcome those of you tuning in to one of our programs for the first time. These programs are all offered free of charge, and you are more than welcome to join us for any or all of our programs at no cost. But I do want to extend a special thank you to all of you who have added a donation to your registration. It's very much appreciated, and it helps us keep our virtual lights on during this time. The Indiana Council on World Affairs is a community of people thinking globally and sharing an interest in events around the world and their meaning to us here in the United States. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit educational organization founded 65 years ago in 1955, when I was a very young man. Our purpose is to foster public understanding of world conditions and US foreign policy through forums, lectures, and academic competitions. We strive to understand various perspectives on the events shaping the world around us. And thus, the views expressed by our speakers are their own and are not intended to represent the opinions of our council, board, or members. Unlike online lectures and podcasts and TED Talks, our Distinguished Speaker Series also offers a unique opportunity to interact directly with experts through our extended question and answer session following each presentation. So this is really a unique opportunity to let thought leaders and decision makers know what is important to you. So please feel free to jump into the Q&A session. I want to thank the Indiana Economic Development Corporation for sponsoring this evening's program. And as such, I welcome Sillian Turner, who is the Director of International Programs at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, as one of our newest board members. But at this time, I'd like to introduce Andrea Richter-Garry, who is Vice President of International Engagement at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, to extend her own welcome to the group. Andrea?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry, and thank you for welcoming me here tonight. So the IADC is a proud sponsor of tonight's event and also the work of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. So since its inception, the ICWA has had a rich history in Indiana, encouraging Hoosiers to critically think about the global political and economic landscape. However, where I think it adds some of the most value to our state is that it asks each of us to think critically about how Indiana can play a role in this globalizing world. It gives us the opportunity to hear from international thought leaders and other distinguished series members to be able to build a stronger global community here in Indiana. And this is a vision that the IADC and the state of Indiana shares as we also seek to raise our global profile here. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, or IEDC, is the state's lead economic development agency. So we serve Hoosiers by fostering economic growth and innovation across all sectors and industries. So Indiana is known as a national leader in agriculture and advanced manufacturing, and yes, these key industries are indeed our backbone. However, Indiana is also a hub for innovation across other industries such as life sciences, autonomous vehicles, and a vibrant tech scene here. So we are a forward-looking state, and workforce and skill development is at the core of our economic agenda. Through initiatives such as Next Level Jobs, Indiana is laser focused on helping tens of thousands of Hoosiers meet the demands of a 21st century economy. So we're not just focused on the jobs of today, but how do we prepare Hoosiers to be ready for the jobs of tomorrow and grow these industries? We also realize that it's the partners that connect us that are critical to our growth. So Indiana is actually home to more than 1,000 foreign-owned enterprises, and that actually supports 200,000 workers in the state of Indiana, and that number is growing every single day. Since 2017 alone, Indiana has secured commitments from businesses to create more than 100,000 new jobs. So myself and my team are dedicated each and every day to lifting those numbers. This has also been a very challenging time, as you know, and we recognize more than ever that our growth comes from beyond our borders. So as we're focused on the global pandemic and economic recovery, we realize that this has disrupted the global landscape, but the world is more connected ever before. But that means the opportunities and the challenges we face are shared. Some of you may have heard that the state was putting on the first ever inaugural Indiana Global Economic Summit this past April. We had to unfortunately postpone that until the public health situation improves. But we were so heartened by not just our community here in Indiana, but our partners around the world, that they responded to the core message of the event. And that theme was advancing new solutions and tackling global issues together. So we hope that we can introduce this event later in the year when the health situation improves. Finally, we realize that as a state, our economic prosperity vision is one that needs to be shared by all. So on Tuesday, Governor Holcomb remarked on his commitment to addressing the root causes of inequality and inclusion in our state to remove these barriers. We'll actually be creating as a state Indiana's first ever cabinet level position of the Chief Equity, Inclusion, and Opportunity Officer. So as the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, we are eager to work with this new office to make sure that economic prosperity is for all Hoosiers. So overall, this topic could not be more timely for our state discourse. We are thrilled to welcome Kevin Cassidy virtually to the great state of Indiana. And I think this will be particularly germane for Hoosier businesses and leaders to be able to look at the policies that we have that impact global supply chains, workforce disruptors, and international trade disputes. So with that, thank you again for having us. We're proud to be a sponsor, and we're excited for the important discourse on this topic tonight. So thank you to the ICWA team.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And thank you very much for your sponsorship, and how apropos that, that this topic is the first of the programs that the Indiana Economic Development Corporation has chosen to sponsor. I'm really enjoying seeing so many familiar faces among our attendees, as well as the new faces in the crowd. So, well, it's not quite the same as meeting in person. It still has that feel of getting together with friends to attend an event or to share a meal. So I see lots of old friends on the call tonight. I want to thank you and everyone for tuning in. Another one of our board members, Dr. Ray Montagno, will be co-hosting this event with me and will manage the Q&A segment of the program. Dr. Montagno is an emeritus professor of management from Ball State University here in Muncie, Indiana. But at this point, I want to introduce our intern, Hannah Voss, who is serving as our Zoom webmaster this evening. She'll give you the basic operating instructions for navigating your Zoom connection and how to ask your questions. And then I'll have the honor of introducing Mr. Cassidy, our distinguished speaker. Hannah?
Hello, everybody. So like Larry said, my name is Hannah. So Ray will be the host for all the Q&A. In order to message your questions, if you have one during the event, you go to the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, there will be a blue button that says everyone. If you type the message, then it'll go to everybody. But we would love it if you could scroll down to Ray Montagno's name, and I will put that in the chat so you don't forget it. Click on his name and just send any question that you have directly to him. Additionally, at the bottom of your screen there should be a mute button, which until the Q&A portion, you will not be allowed to unmute yourself. If Ray gets to your question, he might call on you and you could ask your question yourself, at which point you are allowed to unmute yourself. There's also a video button. If you are comfortable, we would love to see your face, but as Larry said, we are recording, so just be aware of that. If you turn your video on, until you turn your video off, we can see you, even if you navigate away from Zoom. And additionally, you can switch between a gallery mode and a speaker mode. So although Mr. Cassidy will be highlighted, there should be a little grid at the top right of your screen, a small grid. That way you could see everybody who has their video on if you'd like to do that. And again, send the message to Ray Montagno. If you'd like to ask the question yourself, you could just tell him that you have a question and he will call on you when the time comes, or you could type out the question yourself and then Ray will read it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. It's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Kevin Cassidy, with over 33 years of international development experience, is currently the director of the International Labor Organization Office, the ILO, for the United States. Prior to this appointment, Mr. Cassidy served as the Senior Communications and Economic and Social Affairs Officer in the ILO Office for the United Nations, with additional responsibility for partnerships in North America. Before his assignment to New York, Mr. Cassidy was the Chief Technical Advisor for the ILO's global campaign on promoting fundamental rights at work, focused on such issues as decent work, child labor, forced labor, discrimination, and freedom of association. Mr. Cassidy has worked in several UN offices during his career, including the Department of Peacekeeping Operations on the issue of landmines, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, the UN Department of Public Information, and in the executive offices of Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali and Ban Ki-moon. I think you can see that Mr. Cassidy understands how multilateral organizations work and the important leadership role that the US has traditionally played in these institutions. Mr. Cassidy holds a master's degree in economic and political development from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Mr. Kevin Cassidy, welcome to our distinguished speaker program.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm greeting from Washington, D.C., where I am tonight. Our office is located here in downtown Washington. I'd like to also express my appreciation to the Indiana Council for World Affairs, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, and those individuals who have made this possible, who are behind the scenes. Larry, Hannah, Carlton, thank you so much. Thank you for all your time tonight, and I'm delighted to be with you here this evening, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions at the end of my presentation. It really is a great pleasure for me to introduce you to the best kept secret in the international economic and development community, the International Labor Organization. Over the next half hour, I'll introduce you to the ILO, what it is, what it does, why it is unique, and I'll speak about how the ILO sees the challenges and the trends and the way forward in the future of work for all women and men. And I will conclude with an overview of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the world of work and the economy. So what is the ILO? The ILO brings together representatives of 187 governments, along with their national employers and workers organizations, to advance economic and social progress by setting and monitoring labor standards, researching, collecting, and distributing data on labor markets and their economies, collaborating with multilateral and local organizations, building the capacity of governments and national institutions, providing policy advice, and implementing projects globally to help working women and men. The ILO is the first international organization established to address the social and economic problems facing the world at the start of the 20th century. A small note is that the ILO's first conference actually took place in Washington, D.C. in 1919, before the first meeting of the League of Nations, making it actually the first international institution that helped chart the way for the United Nations system. The ILO was established by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, along with the League of Nations, when our modern economic system was just one of many competing models. Governments, employers, and workers come to the ILO to discuss and to set the rules that help businesses operate globally on a level playing field, as well as promote the rights of women and men to help them find decent work and to lift them out of poverty. We believe that a decent job is the most sustainable way out of poverty. For the ILO, decent work is about helping governments and employers create conditions for productive work that delivers a fair income, provides equal opportunity, security in the workplace, and helps people at work participate in the decisions that affect their lives. Decent work is about dignity. Decent work is about self-worth. Decent work is about independence and self-sufficiency. So what makes the ILO this unique international organization? The ILO is a normative organization. We are the only internationally recognized body with the authority to set legally binding rules and standards that protect both workers and employers. The ILO standards have influenced labor legislation of every country for the last 50 years. We are an international legal body. You may have heard some of our normative standards on child labor, the elimination of child labor, the elimination of forced labor, the elimination of human trafficking, occupational safety and health, the elimination of violence and harassment at work, and the rules guarding maritime labor. And for those who export, many years ago in Bangladesh, when Rana Plaza had collapsed and took the lives of so many people and put at risk many of the global supply chains, the ILOs stood there and worked with both governments and employers to improve that situation. The ILO has a unique tripartite structure. Tripartitism refers to the governments, the workers, and employers, the actors of the real economy, to meet with an equal voice to discuss, develop, adopt measures to improve conditions, operations, and effectiveness of the world of work. Today, there are 187 countries that are members of the ILO. In the United States, we have the U.S. Council for International Business, which is our main interlocutor, which represents over 300 global corporations and professional firms and industry associations, and provides an unparalleled access to international policymakers and regulatory authorities worldwide. On the workers' side, the AFL-CIO ensures that workers benefit and are not exploited in the transitions and changes in the international economy. The ILO also has a supervisory system. This is the ILO's teeth. International labor standards are backed by a supervisory system that helps to ensure that countries implement the conventions they ratify. The ILO's regulatory system examines the application of these standards in each member country and assists them in proving their application. And one of our major components for this system is our committee of experts, which is composed of 20 independent jurists from around the world. This is not an ILO shop, it is an international independent body. The ILO is an authoritative source of global labor market data. The ILO works directly with national labor statistical bodies and helps harmonize terminology, methodologies, and build technical capacity of developing countries to build better systems that help them provide analysis for more effective policy formulation. The ILO is an international economic actor. The ILO has a seat at the table with the G20 and the G7, where we contribute data, analysis, policy recommendations on labor, economic, and social issues in order to strengthen the global economy. The ILO is also a technical agency of the UN system. The UN system, as many of you will know, is made up of more than 30 affiliated programs, funds, and specialized agencies, all with our own membership, leadership, budgets, and the ILO with its own constitution. Many may not know, but the ILO has also won the Nobel Prize for Social Justice. The ILO had won this award on the anniversary of its 50th years of existence, and it was to promote the fraternity among nations to ensure social justice. And finally, the ILO believes that people matter. Work sits at the nexus of our social and economic lives. Whether you're a business person, entrepreneur, or a person plying your skills, industry, innovation, and time for a fair wage, opportunity, and security, both are contributing to an equitable, sustainable, and inclusive world of work. I'd like to move on to the future of work. And at this point, I'd also like to note Governor Holcomb's Workforce Cabinet's recent report, A Better Future for Every Hoosier, one of the first World of Work reports in the US, which has policy recommendations, which I'm happy to say are similar to the ILO's. The focus on education and training, employment, and ultimately upward economic mobility, and a shift in the conversation from programs to people. This provides a lot of parallels to the ILO's work. For the ILO, in the lead up to our centenary, a global commission was formed and delivered a report entitled Work for a Brighter Future. This is an in-depth examination of the future of work, and this report outlines the steps that we see that are needed to achieve a future of work that provides decent and sustainable opportunities for all. As the ILO has observed for a while now, there are new forces transforming our world of work. These represent not only major challenges, but also remarkable opportunities. The future of our societies depend on how we deal with these challenges and opportunities. These new challenges or mega drivers of change include technological developments, climate change, globalization, demographic shifts, and now, given the COVID-19 pandemic, we will need to add the impact of pathogens, viruses, and diseases that can fundamentally disrupt human interaction and commerce. The ILO report calls for a human-centered agenda for the future of work. This approach reorients the economy towards the human-centered growth through economic and social policies and business practice. It is a bold vision, but it does prepare people to realize their full potential and to realize the rights at work and economic growth. This agenda is based on 10 recommendations focused around 3 pillars of action. The first pillar is investing in people's capabilities. The second is investing in the institutions of work. And thirdly, investing in decent and sustainable work. In referring to the investment in people's capabilities, the ILO believes that this is the cornerstone of a reinvigorated social contract, and it's not just about investing in human capital, but supporting the broader human development. These include a recognition of lifelong learning, support for people in work transitions, and here we mean the transition from school to work, job to job, and job to retirement. We also are focused on gender equality that must be made a reality with transformative and measurable steps. And lastly, under the first pillar is the lifelong social safety nets. This allows workers to navigate not only their transitions, but also to protect populations in their health, their education, their improvement in their skills and opportunities in life, as well as for businesses themselves to have continuity with the workforce. The second pillar in investing institutions, here we are speaking about the relations and the contracts and the collective agreements and inspection systems, which are the building blocks of a just society in the world of work. We are looking at not only the protection of the rights and basic working conditions, such as adequate living wages, limits on the hours of work, but also flexibility in how work is done through time sovereignty. This includes a guaranteed minimum for on-call workers as well. Also, we are speaking about representing collective dialogue, which gives the legitimacy to decisions and supports wage policy. Digital means can be used to create forms of connected action, and workers' organizations are adapting these strategies to include informal workers and gig workers. And lastly, in the second pillar is the human in command of technology. Technology can free workers from dirty, difficult, and dangerous tasks, or reduce worker control and employment opportunities. But we do believe that by working together, workers and employers can have better control over their opportunities and growth. The last pillar is increasing investment in decent and sustainable work. Here we're looking at reshaping business incentive structures to encourage long-term, responsible investment in the real economy. For example, adopting new indicators of progress and moving beyond the GDP. We need to track the human-centered progress, and rather than judge progress in terms of government spending and value of goods. Also, we look at companies extending stakeholder representation and looking at a more genuine accountability. So the ILO looks at the stakeholder model, not only just the shareholder model. And lastly, measuring success for long-term and more inclusivity, and moving beyond just bottom line reporting, and really genuinely reflecting activity, impact, and growth of the business community as well. So what does this mean? Raising household incomes and purchasing supports consumption and therefore higher demand for products made by business. A human-centered development agenda offers a way to boost productivity, to improve skills, to have better access to technology, and greater investments in the real economy. All actors, governments, workers, society, multilateral institutions, we all have a role to play and need to take a responsibility for delivering on the recommendations that I've outlined above. The future of work and of our societies depends on choices. These choices will address how we deal with the challenges of inequality, working poverty and unemployment, as well as supporting people through those transitions of school to work, from job to job, and from work to retirement. At this stage, I'd like to speak a little bit about COVID-19 and the impact on unemployment and employment. COVID-19 pandemic has caused a socioeconomic crisis of really unprecedented scope and reach. Worldwide, it has led to massive decline of working hours, which is equivalent to about 400 million full-time jobs. It has also exposed structural inequalities related to economic and social safety nets in the labor market, particularly those based on race, gender, and age. The pandemic is hitting disproportionately women and the most vulnerable populations, especially the poorest, and many of whom work in the informal economy. As a result of the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen global output fall by 8%, as compared to 2.2% of the 2008-2009 Great Recession. And global merchandise trade now has fallen anywhere between 13 to 32%, as compared to 12.2% in the Great Recession. So long-term unemployment has doubled its historical high, and household net worth has dropped by 18%. This is globally over $10 trillion. The crisis of 2008-2009 was primarily a demand shock, whereas the COVID-19 crisis is both a supply and demand shock. Why is this so? Well, in the early months of the crisis, 6 countries with the most cases of COVID-19 were China, Germany, Italy, Japan, Korea, the United States, and these countries make up 50 to 60% of the global share of overall output, manufacturing output, and exports. These are the central hubs of global supply chains. So while falling exports as a result of COVID-19 have had a more immediate impact on employment, a more fundamental challenge for developing countries may result from the possible restructuring of global supply chains. So when we speak about restructuring, it includes the reshoring or nearshoring of production from developing countries back towards developed countries. This may also generate greater reliance on regional supply chains and increasing supplier diversity by sourcing of intermediate inputs from different countries, referred to as multiple sourcing. And also reshoring is closely linked to the automation of production, which could in principle offset the importance of labor costs in determining multinational enterprises' production location decisions. So how have other countries responded to this crisis? So the ultimate test in the success of the policy responses and how quickly and effectively we are to protect workers and employers from the loss of income and to ensure that small and medium enterprises, which are the engines of growth, have opportunities to move forward. We start to look at increasing the credit available to these institutions and creating business credit availability programs to provide direct lending and other types of financial support, which can be key to our recovery. In South Africa, the Community Works program was quickly upscaled to create additional job opportunities, allowing for a quick response to the pandemic, and that resulted in 10,000 community-based health workers who were hired to test, trace, screen, and monitor the spread of COVID-19. In Jordan and Portugal, they are supporting refugees and migrant workers and others engaged in the informal economy through the access to financial services and work permits, income support and job retention initiatives, health services, as well as longer-term measures to support a transition out of the informal economy. In Canada, they are providing a 75% wage subsidy through the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy to enable employers to rehire workers previously laid off as a result of COVID-19, and to help prevent further job losses and be better positioned to resume normal operations once the crisis is ended. This is a job retention policy rather than an unemployment insurance policy. There also exists in Germany the same process. We call it Kurzarbeit. In France, Activité Partielle. And in the United States, the CARES Act had funded these short-term compensation programs as well. So how are we going to build back better? The ILO looks at a number of approaches, looking at the economic and, of course, the policies by the governments and the local communities. So our first pillar is about stimulating the economy and employment. We recommend the active fiscal policies, which is the use of government spending and taxation to help us get through the hard times. Monetary policy, making more money available by reducing the cost of borrowing, and lending and financial support to specific sectors, including the health sector. Health at work is so important to productivity and to the continuity of businesses, as well as to the individual's livelihoods. The second pillar is supporting enterprises, jobs, and incomes. There we look at extending the social safety net to all. What this means is a set of policies and programs designed to reduce and prevent poverty and vulnerability through a person's life cycle. We are also recommending implementing employment retention measures, as I mentioned some examples above, and also providing financial and tax and other reliefs incentives for enterprises. The third pillar is looking at protecting workers in the workplace. This is, as you can imagine, looking at strengthening occupational safety and health measures. adapting work arrangements such as teleworking, but we know that not everyone can telework, and this requires a more creative collaboration between employers and the workforce. We are also looking at preventing discrimination and exclusion. We need everyone who has the skills and the desire to be included in the economy, and also to provide health access for all. More importantly, and this speaks to the increase of women's workforce participation, is expanding access to paid leave and the sharing of family responsibilities. The last pillar is relying on the communication and dialogue between workers and their workforce for innovative solutions to these challenges, strengthening the capacity and the resilience of employers and workers' organizations, strengthening the capacity of governments, strengthening communication and collective bargaining and labor relation institutions and processes. At this point, I'd like to close by stating the obvious. Before us, we have a monumental task of rebuilding a future of work that works for everyone. We must tackle the injustices that the pandemic has highlighted, as well as address the major challenges presented by the digital revolution, which is upending our view of work. Major demographic transitions, which are different in all parts of the world, as well as the need to ensure that all women and men have access to decent and productive work to create a better life for themselves and their children. Thank you.
Ray, you want to take over here?
Oh, okay. Yes, thank you. So I will be kind of managing the Q&A section here. If you, as Hannah suggested earlier, if you go to the chat screen at the bottom, and she has my name listed there, if you just click that you'd like to, or you want a question, you can type your question in, or you say you have a question, and I will call on you, and you will can unmute yourself and then ask your question. So at this point, I don't see any questions, but I have a couple of questions that I can get us started with. Kevin, different, often policies may differ depending on industries. Do you consult with different industries, say the steel industry, mining, that are, obviously in different positions globally?
Thank you very much, Ray. Absolutely. The ILO not only has embedded in its structure the employers and workers, so the representative of those people and the industries themselves, but we have a very robust research department called Sector that looks at all sectors of the economy. So yes, the policies will be different from mining to agriculture to light and heavy machinery to other sectors as well. So very important that we get the policies right. And because the ILO has that unique tripartite structure, we are getting the voices of the people who are actually on the ground working on these issues, people who are investing in the machinery and in greenfield productions. And so it is absolutely essential to listen to the people who know and are working every day in those sectors for what is the best way forward.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here from Bruce Frank. He was wondering about the basic income, whether or not Andrew Yang's policy or suggestion was a good idea, or what the ILO's position is on this.
Right. There are lots of theories out there about how to provide better for people. Certainly job creation is a very difficult thing, especially when you have mature industries, and the digital revolution has created new jobs, but it also has destroyed other jobs. So we're looking at how we can provide for people. The Director General of the ILO, Guy Ryder, in a presentation here at the think tank CSIS, had said that UBI, Universal Basic Income, even though that became a kind of an interesting idea, he says it doesn't really work for him because it means that we're giving up on work. Now, there are many other ways in which to ensure that people are protected. I mentioned these social safety nets. For us, we use the word social protection, which is this life cycle approach. So in the United States, for example, you may have nutritional assistance for young people because it's important for children to have that, right? So if that is a right, that you have access to food, I think that's very important. Then it is looking at the transition to school, having pre-K, opportunities for young children so they can start to develop their skills and their knowledge base, by helping have access to higher education, by looking at the transition from school into work, by looking at active labor market policies, by the reskilling and upskilling of workers, by the transitions from job to job. The days of having one job for 40 years, I don't think will ever exist again. People will have multiple jobs that they'll be working in their course of their professional life. And then, of course, at the end of that, the idea of transitioning to retirement. Pensions are an idea that unfortunately doesn't have much traction, but we rely upon that. The public policy in the United States, and I'm from Brooklyn, New York myself, and it was very important to my grandfather when he had retired, is Social Security. Now, Social Security is actually a whole cloth idea of the ILO. Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor in the FDR administration, had come to our conference. They thought it was a great idea. That, along with the Public Works program, provided a cornerstone for creating opportunities and the building of the middle class. So I think we have to look back at history to give us inspiration to move forward, but we also have to look at innovation. That's why we work with the U.S. Council for International Business to see what the brightest minds in the industry are thinking. We work with the AFL-CIO to see how they're looking at the protection of their workers and the upskilling and the opportunities for workers. So I think that there are enough policy ideas out there that we are working on, but we have it based on solid and robust research.
Okay. Hannah, I think you have a question.
Yes, I can ask my second question, which is, how will the social safety nets that you mentioned be funded, especially since so many people are low on cash due to the pandemic?
Right. The social safety nets are actually a function of government. And with that, we have to see what is the impact of that, right? So this is not a cost. This is an investment. This is why we have a human-centered development agenda. It is about investing in people, investing in their skills, investing in their productivity, investing in their opportunities, having active labor market policies, looking at finding work for people, identifying opportunities for technical work, for trades work. Many of the skills that may become redundant through the fourth industrial revolution, as it's called today, does not affect electricians and plumbers. I've traveled around the United States speaking to 185 workers in 16 states and 60 cities in my Dignity at Work initiative, and it's hard to have a machine or a robot do the plumbing in a building or do electricity. So all jobs there will still have some value. In terms of the investment, greater productivity means higher wages, more profit for companies, more disposable income, greater goods to be bought. So don't see the investment in these social safety nets as a net loss. It is investing in people. And we need to invest in people in order to have a more dynamic and leading economy in the world today.
All right, we have a question from Beth here. She said, overall, do you think there's been progress in the power balance between governments and business and labor? And maybe want to add into that, there's some differences in across political systems.
Right. It's the job is not done. I think we at the ILO are very proud of our tripartite structure. There are no other institutions in the international sphere that have the same structure. It may be government to government, where even businesses are precluded. So the ILO is the only place where both the worker and the employer can actually speak to policymakers and actually help set those policies. So that is really quite important to understand, that you need to have that dynamic interaction by those three parties in order to ensure that you have the equity that is needed. Now, it is true that there is a disproportionate power relationship, but I do believe that people who are in the workplace do believe that, we have to be in a going concern. If you ask for too much, obviously the business may not be sustainable or survivable, and businesses have to have that continuity plan. So I do think that we look at this as that we're in it together. So the more effective, the more productive, the more industrious that people are, the greater those profits will be for the company, and hence we'll have a virtuous circle. So we do believe that it is mutually reinforcing rather than antagonistic.
Andrea, I think, has a question.
Yes. Thank you, Ray. Kevin, thanks for your remarks. You mentioned a few times the gig economy, and I know that's taking kind of a bigger piece of the pie in many of these countries. And that's made it a little bit more vulnerable, as we're seeing during this recent pandemic. So I'm wondering if COVID-19 health crisis has changed any of the research you're doing on the gig economy, any of the questions you're asking, or any of the policy recommendations to kind of meet more of an immediate need, since this is laying bare some of the inefficiencies from that type of economy.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's an excellent question, because that's where we're going, right? I mean, the structure of the economy is such that, as we see it, certainly internationally, because we have to take on board that international perspective, is that, there are some jobs that can be done remotely. So the pandemic has forced us to telework. So if we are knowledge workers, if we are higher level managers, we can do a lot of that work, remotely. But there is a whole segment of society that needs to be on the job. In terms of the gig economy, the problem with that is that it has broken down jobs into very small parcels, so that individuals have to always be looking for the next job. And I'll use, for example, Uber for that. We have done the analysis, we've seen other analyses on this, and we've seen some that say that most people in the gig economy are spending 20 minutes out of every hour looking for their next gig, right? It's a one-off task. The Freelancers Union in New York City had indicated that gig workers, that 40% of the gig workers that have already completed a task were not being paid for that. What is their recourse? They have no recourse. So there has to be a voice. There has to be an agency for this in terms of being able to allow people to exercise their industry, their skills, and trading that in for a fair remuneration. But who is there to help them? Who is there to protect them? So the gig economy has really challenged us. And to be honest with you, there are many economies around the world that have been faced with this for a very long time. So for example, in Africa, and particularly in Southern Africa, people are used to having 5, 6, 7 jobs in 1 week. So they're much more dynamic in responding to one-off tasks. We, and I in particular, I've been very lucky. I work for an organization. I'm with the UN system for 36 years now. I hate to admit that, but it is becoming more and more difficult for people to find enough work in order to have a gainful employment. Now, if people are not earning a living wage, they are unable to afford buying a house, so the housing market goes down. They're unable to buy those extra items for themselves. Disposable income is very low. So the economy starts to slow down and it starts to stagnate. So it's really important to get it right, because the gig economy is only going to grow. And that is giving us a real, illustrative example about how we have to be looking at this, not just from the company side or the worker side, but we're in this together. How do we move forward? How do we create opportunities for both sides of that equation?
Okay, Larry, I think you got a question there.
Yes, thanks. I did have a question about the gig economy, but I guess to lead on to that, what teeth does the ILO have to implement some of the programs that you talked about, so that you've described, and which groups in the USA do you work through? I mean, you say there's the tripartite organizations, but you have labor management and government. And who in labor management and government do you work through, and what teeth do you have to implement things in the US, and then how does it play out overseas in terms of being able to actually push down some of these programs that you've described so well?
Right. So our partners in the United States, and this is replicated all over the world, the ILO are the members. So governments, workers, and employers from 187 countries, that is the International Labor Organization. I belong to the Secretariat, the office, which means that I listen to what they have to say, listen to the results of their discussions, and then implement that. We work very closely with the Department of Labor, particularly the International Labor Administration Bureau, ILAB, which has been a leader in supporting the elimination of child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. We work very closely with the State Department, with the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, increasingly with USAID. So these are the sort of government mechanisms we work with. But increasingly, we work with departments such as Customs and Border Protection, where you have, for example, maybe a country that doesn't have the same law enforcement, and children are working in those factories because it may, provide lower labor costs. Of course, the quality becomes suspect as well. But then that puts the companies that are playing by the rules at a disadvantage. So all of those enforcement mechanisms come into play. In terms of the business community, as I mentioned, the U.S. Council for International Business, which represents over 300 multinational corporations and business associations in the United States, is a direct partner of the ILO. We have constant contact with them. They provide advisory services to their member companies in order to effectively operate overseas, see opportunities, and have a voice in the establishment of international policies. And of course, on the trade union labor movement, it is the AFL-CIO, which represents a constellation of labor unions in the United States, and their voices come to bear as well too. So we do have a very strong dialogue between those. So how is that enforced? It is enforced not only through those entities themselves, but also through what I mentioned, our supervisory mechanism. And the supervisory mechanism is that if a country is not living up to the provisions of the convention that they have ratified, then an employer or a worker or even the government itself can reflect on that, and then the ILO will discuss that. The ILO does not go into a country and browbeat anyone. We have to be invited in. We have to work. And it is the other governments and the other workers' organizations and the businesses that will come together and find a solution for that. We are a deliberative body. So it's, we have this supervisory mechanism that always puts us on the agenda for ourselves. And we've had great successes throughout the years. There are some problems that take 5, 10, 20, 50 years. Some problems we haven't been able to crack. For example, in forced labor. Our first convention on forced labor was back in 1930. We've had 2 other conventions since then, and a recommendation and a protocol in order to address the changing nature of forced labor, which sometimes today people call human trafficking, the exploitation of individuals, of young women and men. So there is that supervisory mechanism. And then finally on that, we work with non-governmental organizations. We communicate our products, our knowledge products, our statistics, and our research with the media, and then that is then promulgated throughout society. And then finally, it is the individuals. It is the people who themselves decide, I want to see this change being made. So people who are in this call today may work for an organization or a human rights group, and they are dedicated to ensuring that my clothes are coming from good sources, that the products that are being used are actually following those rules. So we do rely upon the wider constellation of society to bring that pressure to bear.
Okay, another question here from Claire. She wanted to know if there's a movement for a global minimum wage.
It's an interesting question. Minimum wage is something that is set at the local level, as you can imagine. I mean, a minimum wage in India will be very different than a minimum wage in Indiana, for example. I was just looking a bit earlier at our records. So, for example, a country like Madagascar, where an annual wage is $440. I think in Indiana, the GDP per capita is about $49,000. Now, these are different economies. There are different costs and different scales. So the wage setting mechanism has to be done between the workers and the employers, with the input and the oversight of the government in how to move that forward, because all local conditions are not the same. So we do believe in a living wage, which again is a very complex idea. What does that mean in different environments? But we do believe that people do need to have an opportunity to be able to advance in society. I must admit that not everybody has the opportunity to have a single job. So if we are trying to put together all these different jobs, like we were talking about the gig economy, it's very hard to be able to provide for your children's schooling or to have a home ownership. I mean, this is what builds wealth. This is what creates a greater velocity of income within the economy. So I do think that this is going on, but the wage setting mechanism are at the local level and through the collective bargaining process between the workers and employers discussions.
Thank you. Steve Simon, you're up next here.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Cassidy, for your talk tonight. I'm interested on how ILO what policies it may have or what it's developing with respect to probably our biggest crisis, which is global climate change. It's got to be affecting every economy. It certainly is ours. Some people think COVID's just one of the symptoms of that. And if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much. I mean, the climate change for us in the international community is quite real. And for many people here, you don't even have to go to India or to Siberia, where the tundra is melting, and maybe all the pathogens that have been sequestered for centuries now are being released into the atmosphere. So there is an intimate sort of connection. I was recently in Hawaii, looking at the coral reefs. And I was totally taken aback by the fact that it was actually local people who bleached the coral reef because they were afraid that too many tourists were coming in and were going to destroy the coral reef. But they went out and took action to destroy it themselves so it wouldn't attract people. So it was an amazing sort of situation. So, but then you also have, as we know, the stories that the farmers in the Midwest, that the fields are too wet. You can't plant when the fields are too wet. Or we don't have enough labor to come in because of COVID-19 social distancing. So people can't harvest the fruits. They can't harvest the vegetables, and they have to be plowed back into the field, right? So climate change is a real phenomenon. It is shifting of the patterns, sometimes too much rain, sometimes too little rain, sometimes too cold, sometimes too hot. So it is happening to us. So the ILO does work with the United Nations. As many people here may know, there is the Sustainable Development Goals. I was very fortunate to be a part of the team in New York that negotiated Goal 8 on decent work and productive employment. But I work very closely with the United Nations Environmental Program. It's important to look at these issues because if you have no crops, you don't have income, and people don't have jobs and businesses go bust. So climate change is real. When the ice caps are melting and the sea levels are rising, we know that there are islands in the South and the Pacific region are going to be underwater. I was just down in Miami Beach, for example, speaking to some people, and Miami Beach has these huge pumps to keep the land dry, because if they didn't pump it out within a week, most of that land would be underwater. So we do have to recognize that these changes are real, and it's not to fight, the battles of whether it's real or not. You can see it. You can see it happening. So the ILO takes that into account as well, because as I said, the work situation sits at that nexus of the economic and the social as well as the environmental.
Thank you.
Very timely question there. Thank you, Steve. Sillian Turner, you're next.
Hi, thank you. Nice to see you again, Kevin. Thank you for all of your comments. I've learned a lot. My question is around, what do Hoosier businesses need to understand regarding potential impacts of international trade disputes? Specifically in the advanced manufacturing space, possible impacts to supply chains I'm thinking about. And to give you a little bit of background, approximately 1 in 5 adults in Indiana works in advanced manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. Thank you very much, and good to see you again as well. When you're looking at global supply chains, this is a very complex, so many moving parts in that. We have to source materials, so maybe those intermediate inputs are not available. or the just-in-time production doesn't allow to fulfill those orders in time. When we had, for example, the impact of COVID-19 and we had the severe lockdown and people were not traveling on airplanes, the products, particularly agricultural and horticultural products, were not getting to market in time. So those planes were sitting fallow. They were not going, they were not flying out the products. So the end market is not there for them either. So when you are working in the global supply chains, you are actually a part of a very complex web of activities. And if one of those suppliers or one of the manufacturers who you're relying upon to make a part can't deliver in time because there's no flight to bring it, or the materials that they needed to make that part are not there, it really destroys that business. I was in Indonesia not too long ago and looking at, for example, that in the factories that make sneakers, without mentioning brands, and so there's 160 parts to that sneaker, and that has to be all assembled. So it is important to ensure that not only do you have the material coming in and the sequencing and the availability of exporting that out, but it's also ensuring that the people who are working in those factories, that their rights are protected as well too. I mean, if people are too tired because they're working too hard, or they have to work in, for example, in developing countries, it's usually young women who are working in these factories. About 90% are young women working in these factories. If they don't have a sort of good nutritional intake, that causes problems. They fall asleep, there's an injury on the line, production then shuts down, so they're behind on their orders. So it is important that the workers and the employers have an agreement on how do we treat people in the workplace. So it's not only just out there, it is here as well too. So, we think about it, and I think some people think back to the fact that, somebody had worked in a factory, so that allowed maybe one person in the house to have a job. I think most of that is probably gone now. We have to work in two jobs, or the mother and the father in the family, or other people in the family have to contribute to the family coffers in order to make up that difference. So it is about the business plans, but it is also about treating workers right, because a worker who feels that they are respected in the workplace, and that happens to all of us, whether you are working in agriculture or you're working in financial services, if you feel that you are valued, you are going to be more industrious, you are going to be more productive, you are going to be more loyal to that brand. So it is really important to ensure that those labor rights are respected. And then lastly to say is that even though maybe some of these rights may be acceptable here or acceptable there, or maybe we haven't signed conventions, and so you will be operating in environments where they will have those laws in place, so that you will be responsible to pay certain minimum wages, to ensure that children are working in your factories, to make sure that people have the right breaks, to make sure that occupational safety and health is important there. So it's not just about looking at this as a cost. As I said before, it's about investing in the people. And as any HR manager knows, that it takes 18 months to recoup the cost of hiring one person. So if people keep rotating in and out of your factory or in and out of your business, you're always going to be on the short end of that. So we have to work together.
All right, thanks. Bruce Frank had a question. He said, up till today, jobs have found the lowest cost labor sources since the Industrial Revolution, when jobs left England and came to the United States. It's what Adam Smith told us is the case. What will that continue in the light of populist movement and perhaps temporarily? So what is sort of the kind of ILO's position, I guess, on movement of jobs to low cost sites?
Yeah. Look, it's true that the United States and other industrialized countries have benefited over the last 50 years. But now what we're seeing is that wages are stagnating and costs are increasing. In our latest global wage report, it was in the sort of least developed and the developing countries where wages have increased the most. Now, of course, that just depends on where your starting point is. So if you're just getting paid the equivalent of 50 cents for a day's worth of work, and then you make $1, for someone in India or in Indonesia or in Namibia, maybe that might be okay. It's still not enough. But when you are in an advanced economy and your wages are going down or they have stagnated, and I think if we look at purchasing power parity, that wages in the United States have slid tremendously. And the ripple effect of that just means that people won't have home ownership. They won't be able to have the disposable income to buy the goods and services to create a greater velocity of income in that economy. So it is a situation that countries like Japan have faced for a while, and that I think here in the United States that we're facing as well too. So that's why I said we have to work together to ensure that if the pie is bigger, and people have the opportunity to not only apply their skills in their trade, in their industry, in the exchange for a fair wage, that we will create more markets for ourselves. But we are running up against resource capacity issues. We are running up against greater competition. And what I see, for example, in a lot of countries that maybe we sourced raw products from are now moving to value-added products. So Indonesia is no longer just exporting the teak or the other hardwoods that are there. They're making furniture. They're using that to create other goods for themselves. And they are then competing against more mature economies like ourselves, and they could undercut us in the costs only because they're at a much lower price point. So I think we're going to have to be very creative in what does the new economy mean? What does the new social contract mean? And that's why issues such as social safety nets and the protection of rights in the workplace, because even employers are workers themselves.
Okay, thank you. Kind of maybe on a sort of similar note, some countries like Japan have a declining population, and they're moving quickly to automate as many jobs as possible to keep up their standard of living. Other countries, poor countries with high number of young people, want jobs. They don't want to automate. Is this application of technology going to exacerbate these kind of wealth distribution differences between these countries?
Yeah, I think you're onto something very interesting there. I mentioned before about the mega drivers of change and the sort of demographic shifts. So you're absolutely right. Japan has an aging population. So you have this inverted cone, whereas in Africa or in the Middle East, you have a pyramidal structure. So younger people getting into the economy, looking for opportunities for themselves. The decision to automate and to use technology is going to be a political decision. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where 65% of the population works in agriculture and mainly in subsistence agriculture, if you brought in GPS enabled, combine harvesters that would, plow the fields and create food security for everybody, that's all well and good. But what are you doing with the tens of millions of people that are displaced from their jobs? So technology introduction is going to be a decision that the government is going to have to take, because there are consequences to that. And maybe to kind of roll back slightly, that, the ILO was created at a time of war. It was the end of World War I, where you had men who were fighting in the war coming home looking for those jobs. When you have millions and millions of people who don't have gainful employment for themselves, that's when the economic situation spills into the social sphere and then spills into the political sphere. So it is really important to create jobs, good jobs, that create resilience within that society. So I can't say that we have the magic, the silver bullet to fix all of this, because it is something that we've faced technological change before. The future of work has always been here. Whether you went from the paddle boat to the sail, or from the oxen cart to the tractor, or from doing things by hand to having the Industrial Revolution. So the the future of work has always been changing. It is just now digital. And the reason we call it the fourth industrial revolution is because before it was having machinery do the physical work for us, to make the physical work easier. Now what we have is that we have technology that is making the intellectual and the analytical work redundant for humans. So we are going to be facing very important challenges. The earlier question you asked about, maybe universal basic income or other ways in which to provide for people. We're going to have to find very creative and innovative ways, because population is growing. We are at 7.5 billion. In the next 15 years, it will be 9 billion. How will we have food for everyone? How will we have drinkable water? How will we have jobs for everyone? How will we be able to, manage this process? So there are some very serious questions that we will see ahead of us, and we're going to have to figure that out together.
All right, thanks.
Can I ask a question? Bob Larrick, your old friend from the UN, wanted to say hello.
Bob,
and
how are
thank
you?
for
Good to
your
see you.
good work. Can the central bankers and IMF do more? And I know the US central bank has been saying we need more stimulus really for our states and safety net programs. And I was just on the other day with also our corporations, the Business Roundtable, with its new stakeholder statement, if you're familiar with, which not only includes profits, well, greed is good, but the importance of employees, stakeholders, and the community. And the community, as well as the stakeholders and the world we're leaving our children, the social safety net of health, which is also a huge concern when the US economy, which is a global consumption engine of the world, is having such a terrible record with its health and recovery. The impact on the global economy as well as the US economy, and the importance of some of these safety net issues, health, etc., and to develop a different political need to develop a better political culture, which I just got off, I'm sorry I'm here late, on a Midwestern World Affairs conference on the UN, and the need to find ways of working together better for sustainable peace and prosperity, as you bring up with the new technology, and the importance of financing, of which whoever thought the central banks could come up with so much money. But when your performance, health-wise and economically, statistics or benchmarks aren't doing very well, it jeopardizes the value of the dollar. And I know I've seen other statements also by economists that we need a better way of evaluating and measuring, besides just GDP alone, about the better need for better social well-being. Doesn't the resentment and hostility and violence in so many countries create problems that need more long-term sustainable peace and prosperity orientations, and less power struggles for power, control, and dominance, which oftentimes leave other people excluded or not cared for, and the importance of values and cultures, even from a banking, of a more humanistic nature, of course,
Right.
but
So, Bob,
for a healthier economy.
yeah, Bob, thank you very much, and good to see you again. Look, you've got a lot of issues in there. So maybe to get to the issue of the banks, right? So, earlier on, Larry and I were having a conversation about, one of the parts of my title, which is the representative for the Bretton Woods, which is more than a ski resort up in New Hampshire. It is where the global financial system was created, and this is the World Bank. It is the International Monetary Fund. It is the International Financial Corporations and the EBRD, and so it, at one point in time, a particular snapshot, we did not know what the answers were. We had to develop institutions that would be able to work together. That's why the beginning of the multilateral system, starting with, in many ways, with the ILO and the development of the League of Nations, served a particular purpose. Now, I think what the ILO got right was the fact is that we are not just a development organization, we are an international economic actor, right? And we had to ensure that to bring together, those people who were investing their money and their time in creating economic opportunities were measured with the workforce, the talent pool, in order to realize those visions. And we figured it out. Now, we are at a very important and interesting time right now where a lot of these mega drivers are creating new series of problems for us. And, there are lots of discussions with banks today that we're going to get rid of, physical money. We're going to be all digital. There is discussions about, are we going to have universal basic income or social safety nets where people can go off the grid and they will be able to have access to healthcare and education. And education, we know now, is changing dramatically. We have distance learning that's taking place, which is now manifesting itself. So we are at an inflection point that we have to look at these issues, not as this country, you know, in the old empire days, that it was the British Empire or the Spanish Empire or the Portuguese or whatever it might be. Now we are a community of nations. And more than that, we are a community of communities, because we are able to reach out and we're able to talk to people at a micro level. So I think we're going to have to find new ways of inventing ourselves or reinventing ourselves and reinventing the economy. This is a very big discussion. There are so many people working on this, but just to let you know, for example, I was on the phone today with the World Bank, with our regional office for Africa, where the big issues for them are digital Africa. The mobile banking started in Africa because people were going to the store, cashing their checks, and then getting mugged for their money outside. So they decided the better way to do that was to create some electronic transfer of that money, because that was then with a fingerprint or with a PIN code itself. So it pioneered something that was out of necessity. We as a species are very clever people, and we are able to figure these issues out. But what we have to realize, it is not that I gain and you lose, or if you win, I lose. It is not a zero-sum game. We have only one planet. This is what our deputy director generals have been talking about. We have one source of resources. We live on this planet. I'm a child of the Star Trek era. I believe in going beyond. But we are here. We have to look at these resources. We have to look at how we manage this. We have to look at how we interact with one another. So it cannot be a zero-sum game. We have to find these opportunities, and it has to be human-centered, because if it is only about who wins the most or makes the most, we are not going to succeed on this. So I do believe that the World Bank has an opportunity to do this. They are looking at investing in new ways of economies, and this is going to challenge some of the ways that we operate. So as I said, and I say to most of the students that I speak to, that you will never be able to retire. You will always be working, because you do not have a pension system. You will not have that, the Social Security. You will not have the opportunities for healthcare as we're having today. I mean, again, we need to look at that and find better policies and better ways for it. And again, we have to do that as a community of nations, because there is only one race. It's called the human race.
All right, thank you. Ken, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, for your time here. Maybe I'm bringing this down a little bit more specific here, but does the ILO have a position on like Airbnb, where, in quotation marks, the employee, right, works for free in return for an increased return on capital? And the consequence of a lot of people doing this is the employees in the hospitality industry, end up without jobs. So there's almost no employee, and unlike Uber or whatever, where you can argue what the rate for that is, I'm an owner, I'm increasing my capital return at a zero labor rate, which is going to affect people who are at a positive labor rate. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing up some very interesting ideas here. And earlier when we were talking about the gig economy with Andrea, we were trying to kind of find out how this was going to manifest itself. So, for example, with Airbnb, right? Airbnb is one of the biggest accommodation companies that owns no property, right? It's the same thing with Uber, right? It is the biggest transportation company that owns no vehicles, right? So we are now in uncharted territory. But there are recent decisions. For example, in California, the ruling came about that Uber had to treat their drivers as employees. If you tell me where to go, how to dress, how to drive, where to be, that's an employment contract. So this idea about new models of the economy, we have to come to terms with that, and we have to provide protections for people. The ILO does not believe that people should not be able to maximize their well-being by utilizing the assets that they have. There are many people who don't have those assets, as we know. I think we are probably in that last generation that home ownership will be a goal for us. I mean, for a lot of young people, that's not going to be a goal. We're all going to be renters at some point in time. But I do think there has to be protections. Now, if you are an Airbnb owner, you are then maybe hiring somebody to come in and clean the apartment for you because, somebody is coming in and out. You want to, shift that service to somebody else. I certainly don't want to wash the linens or to make sure that the water is in the refrigerator for everybody. So these are new modes of operation. These are new modes of business, and they have to be discussed, at a policy level with the government to make sure that that income comes in as well. Because how do governments get funded? Through taxes, right? I mean, that is one of the ways in which we provide for the citizenry. And if the government cannot provide that service for people in terms of protecting them from a whole variety of issues, or providing them with clean water that they're paying for, or access, to good roads and the like, the model breaks down. So I think we are at a particular inflection point. The ILO has a very big research department which is looking at these issues. I can't do justice to it now, because if you go to the ILO website and you put Airbnb, you will probably get about 80 links of new research that is coming out on that. But I do believe that we have to focus on people. It is about the human-centered approach to this, right? So new models of business that will come. We have to make sure that we play all by the rules, that we make sure that someone is on a level playing field with us. That's the only way that it will work. And without that dialogue, without that communication, I'm afraid that does break down.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Judy, I think you have a question for us. You out there, Judy?
On a hopeful note, you mentioned
There.
Social Security is, am I unmuted now? Okay.
You're okay.
One of the successes. So what are some other things that we may have forgotten were successes of your organization's efforts? Just a couple of them. The conventions clearly are a success, but some other things we might not have top of mind.
Right. Judy, thank you very much for that. We just had our centenary last year, and it gave me an opportunity. I'm a bit of a history buff from way back, and looking at how, for example, the ILO came into being, very much through, in many ways, U.S. leadership before the U.S. even joined our organization. So when President Wilson was talking about these 14 points about the commerce of nations, we realized that we had to sit down at the table and negotiate this, right? What is the alternative to that? War, right? I mean, that characterized the older empires and the way in which people wanted resources, they would go and invade a country. We were at a different point then. We were tired at the end of World War I, seeing mechanized death around us, so we needed to move forward. So that the ILO has this tripartite structure, which no other organization has, it gives legitimacy. So I think the idea of sitting down and discussing the issues and negotiating and compromising, this is something that I think we've forgotten today. I think most people today don't realize how important it is to move us all forward. And if we don't compromise on either side, we don't get to a resolution. So I do think that the idea about having these international bodies that can discuss these issues, that is very important. So if we are looking at how we should be protecting people, so it comes out of our standards, because our standards look at that. For example, violence and harassment at work. This is our latest convention that the ILO has come up with. Very important, because a lot of the research that has been done, we realize that women are not going into the workforce because well, first of all, they have disproportionately family responsibilities which need to be shared. So we do have a set of instructions about how we should share those family responsibilities. Violence and harassment at work. If somebody is harassed at the workplace, they may be traumatized from that. They won't go back. They will lose their ability to earn a living and to have opportunities for themselves. I think that becomes very difficult. The ILO has had success. For example, I mentioned forced labor before, but when I was introduced by Larry, he mentioned that my job was on promoting the fundamental rights. The fundamental rights include elimination of child labor, elimination of forced labor, elimination of discrimination, and freedom of association, collective bargaining, so that people who are in a disempowered relationship can actually negotiate as an equal on that. Now, those rights are now embedded in the trade agreements in the United States. The latest trade agreement, the USMCA with Mexico and Canada, makes specific reference to the ILO and to those prescriptions. Very, very important for moving us forward and ensuring that the community of nations is maintained. We also realize that in terms of the work that we're doing, it is important to ensure that we look at what is happening on the ground in these situations. So when you have, for example, migration, people may be fleeing war, they may be fleeing environmental damage. We have these big issues, for example, in the Middle East, where in Syria, most of the men and young men are dead on the battlefield, and it's the women and the children that are migrating, and they're going into Lebanon, and they're going into Jordan, they're going into other countries. Now, if discrimination becomes overburdening, and they want to push these populations out, then where do they have to go? That's a humanitarian tragedy. So I think we have to realize that we have to protect those who are the most vulnerable. And unfortunately, there's a lot of vulnerability in the world today. We also realized, and I'm reminded of this, that in my going back to my grandfather's stories about Ireland and the troubles that we had, and so is that one thing that was most important was creating jobs. Building resilience in society by creating employment is very, very important. A recent example, or maybe not so recent, is in the Tahrir Square in Egypt, when Mubarak was they called the Pharaoh in Egypt, and no one thought that they would be able to move him out. And young men, and of course, unfortunately, in this instance, the women were not going to school, it was the young men. But in that culture, if a young man doesn't have an education, a job, a house, and a car, they are not going to be able to marry the daughter of somebody else, because they're afraid that maybe a year or two, the daughter will be back in the home of the mother and father, and then that falls apart. So the young men were socially spilling out into the streets and realizing that they didn't have opportunity. Even though they had the good education, they didn't have the opportunity to create a livelihood for themselves and their family. So we have to realize that job creation, the treatment of people, whether they are strangers that come or people who are here, we are all in this together. We have to respect one another. And that's why the ILO has a rights-based approach to its activities. So it is the rights-based approach that will set the standard for all of that. So what have we forgotten? We've forgotten how to respect one another. We've forgotten how to compromise. We've forgotten how to respect the rule of law. And unfortunately, a pursuit for many people is, how much can I earn, maybe at the expense of someone else. So I think the idea is that we want to expand the pie, and $10 million spread amongst 1,000 workers will buy 1,000 refrigerators, 1,000 holidays, 1,000 cars, 20,000 pairs of sneakers. That's better than just having one person getting $100 million and putting it into a financial instrument, and that doesn't go into the real economy and doesn't generate or create jobs. That's why we believe in people in the workplace and ensuring that the real economy is invested in.
Right. I have kind of a complex question here. I'm going to ask you, it's Larry's question, but I'll ask it for him here. As technology replaces jobs, say in mining and truck driving and so forth, those jobs tended to be relatively high-paying jobs. Many of the people that are in those jobs don't have education. They're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, may have difficulty finding equivalent paid jobs. How does the ILO view this? Is this a peculiar to the US, or is this true in other countries as well?
It is true all over. Jobs are becoming redundant. I think earlier, it was mentioned that self-driving or automated cars are a big industry there in Indiana as well. That's the future. I mean, technological advances are going to happen, and we have to realize that that is going to displace people. So how do we look at transitioning those people? So for example, the ILO does share research with, for example, LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is doing the analysis through a project which is called Economic Graph, which is looking at the fungibility of skills. So if I am a truck driver today, and there's going to be a self-driving truck, or we create a new infrastructure where trucks will be in a separate transportation system as well too, so to reduce accidents and the like. Can that truck driver then become a logistic worker? Do they understand the just-in-time delivery? Do they understand the routes? Do they understand the differences in the different states? And so we are working with private sector as well as governments and the workers and employers organizations to ensure that the transition to the future of work is a successful one. This also manifests itself in, say, the green economy, which is probably what self-driving and electric cars will do, is that As we move away from, oil and gas, and we move towards, electricity or solar, wind, wave, geothermal, biomass power that is going to help generate the future, we can actually start building into that a more sustainable model. And that may change the way in which we look at the world around us. It may not be that, buying a house and, spending $130,000 on a degree may not be the characteristic of the future, because people can go online to one of these massive open online courses, the MOOCs, that was pioneered by MIT, that anybody now can go and at home do a degree on just about any subject there is in the world. That is then, challenging the old kind of factory model of the university system. So things are changing. We are at a very unique inflection point right now that it's a lot of people are being impacted upon this, and it gives us an opportunity to build back better, to build back differently, to look at the city planning and urban planning in many different ways that we hadn't expected before. So the future is going to be interesting. It's going to be challenging, no doubt, but I think we have to be innovative, and we have to realize that it's not about protecting the job, it is about protecting people.
All right. And we have one last question. So if somebody's got another question they really want to ask, you can put it up there. But the last one I have is, the feeling in the US is that we can't afford a living wage. It will cause unemployment and other disruptions. Does the ILO have any data on what the impact of having a kind of a living wage is in different countries?
Yeah, I don't have that at my fingertips, but let me throw the question back to you. What is the consequence of not having a living wage? What if people can't afford to rent? What if people can't afford to buy groceries that are necessary for them? What if people can't afford, to have an education for themselves? That's when things start to fall apart. So the consequences of not looking at this as an investment is really quite catastrophic. So we are at an interesting point where we're having debates about issues that are really fundamental to the way of life that we have here, and many other parts of the world. I mean, the U.S. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in a very small town called New York City, but I've traveled around to 65 countries. And when I was appointed to this job, I wanted to reconnect. And I've been traveling around the US this last year and meeting amazing people, from rodeo clowns in Fort Stockton, Texas, to marine biologists in Coconut Island in Hawaii, to robotic surgeons in the Cleveland Clinic. And so looking at all these advancements that are being made, shepherds in Washington, Maine, horse farms in Shelburne, Vermont. We all have different experiences for ourselves, but the one thing that we do have in common is that we want to provide for ourselves and our families. And if that future is under threat because you don't have the opportunity to earn a wage that will allow you to provide for your family, that's when a lot of, as I said before, we set at that very interesting nexus between the social and the economic. And when that becomes disrupted, when we don't have an opportunity to be able to provide for our own people, or for our own family, for our own community, for our own city, for our own state, that's when things become very messy. So I would just put it the other way. I don't think we can afford not to be able to treat people well and not to have a minimum wage. If the minimum wage is so low, how are you going to be able to afford? I don't know what the rent is there, but in Washington, I could not live on the minimum wage here in Washington.
All right. Larry, I think we're going to throw it back to you.
Thank you, Ray. And I really want to thank you, Mr. Cassidy. I think we all know a little bit more about the ILO and the work that you've been doing for over 100 years, not you personally, but the ILO. We learned what the tripartite organizations are, and that's the unique structure of those things. And I think a little more about the role that these multilateral organizations play in dealing with issues that cross geopolitical borders, and why it's important for the US to stay engaged in some of these organizations, because the issues you address do affect us here at home. Wanted to thank Ray Montagno for managing our question and answer interface, and thank everyone out there who has joined us this evening for this program. Our next Distinguished Speaker program will be in a month on September 17th with an update on US-Taiwan relations and commitments. I think it's going to be a fascinating program. We'll be featuring Mr. Eric Huang, who is the Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Chicago. And I don't think you're going to want to miss this one, so put it on your calendar now. Now, we value your participation and your support of our programs. And these forums allow us to increase our knowledge and understanding of the world, and more importantly, to interact with experts within a community of global citizens. So please stick with us and support our programming. I'd like to invite you to join us or to renew your membership for the coming season at our website. It's indianaworld.org. Take a look at it. It doesn't cost much to join us for a year, and we're developing a number of programs that we're pushing out, a number of resources. So you don't even have to be in Indiana to become a member of our Indiana Council on World Affairs. All you have to do is have an interest in what's going on in the world and interest in how it affects you and yours. So stay well. Pay attention to the world around you, and I hope to see you all again soon. And thank you very much to Kevin Cassidy. It's been a delight having you this evening, and good night to all.
Thank you, everyone. All the best.
Thanks, Kevin.